Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this June 22nd meeting of the Charlotte City Council Economic Development Committee. We will start, as usual, today with introductions. My name is Ed Driggs. I am the Vice Chair, and I'm acting for the Chairman, Mr. Graham, who can't be with us today. So can we have introductions from other committee members, please?
Good morning, Dimple Ashmira, committee member.
Greg Phipps, committee member.
Good morning, Charlotte. This is Victoria Watlington, your Charlotte City Council member representing District 3.
And staff members in the room, please.
Good morning, Tracy Dodson, Assistant City Manager.
Christina Thigpen, Deputy Director, Economic Development.
Monica Holmes, Executive Manager, Quarters of Opportunity.
Hey, Donata Jackson, Office of Constituent Services.
Sean Thomas, Assistant Program Manager, CBI.
Stephen Coker, Program Manager, CBI.
Phil Rieger, Director, General Services.
Thomas Powers, City Attorney's Office, Counselor to the Charlotte Business Inclusion Program.
Anybody else in the room? All right.
Naima Mathis, Charlotte Business Inclusion.
Welcome. Anybody else virtual that hasn't introduced themselves? Okay, well, let's get started. We have 3 items today. Charlotte Business Inclusion Disparity Study, Higher Charlotte Corridors of Opportunity Update, and I will turn it over to Tracy Dodson.
Thank you, Councilmember Driggs. We are all very excited to hear about the disparity study and the work that Stephen, you and the team have been doing. So I'm going to kick it over to you.
We're going to start with Phil.
Great. Good morning, Vice Chair Driggs, members of the committee. My name is Phil Rieger, just for the record, Director of General Services. Today with me is Steve Coker, CBI Manager, Thomas Powers, Assistant City Attorney, Senior Assistant Attorney, sorry, Thomas. Sean Thomas, who's our Assistant CBI Program Manager, and Colette Holt with Colette Holt and Associates. Today, we're here to present to the committee the results of the 2022 disparity study. This is a big day for the CBI program. It represents 18 months of really hard work. Disparity studies are the legal foundation for the city's policies around race and gender-conscious goal setting in city contracting. The 2022 study, once adopted by City Council, will replace the 2017 study. So starting with the end in mind, at the end of today's presentation, assuming that the committee is comfortable, staff will be requesting that the committee recommend advancing the study to full council for a presentation and future adoption. So now let me introduce our guest and really the star of the show for today. It was through a competitive process that the city selected Colette Holt and Associates to conduct the disparity study. Ms. Holt will share with the committee the results of the study. Colette is the principal of the Colette Holt and Associates. She has over 25 years representing public agencies and private firms on issues related to civil rights, public contracting, and affirmative action. She's one of the foremost authorities in conducting legally defensible disparity studies. Ms. Holt serves as General Counsel to the American Contract Compliance Association and is author of frequent media commentator on these issues. I know we look forward to hearing this presentation, and I'm pleased to introduce to you Colette Holt. Colette, take it away.
Well, thank you so much, and good morning to everyone. Hopefully you can hear me reasonably well. There's a lot of construction going on outside, and I appreciate the opportunity to make this presentation to you today. Actually, I have to say it's actually more than 30 years I've been working on these programs, because I started out life as an assistant corporation counsel for the city of Chicago. And when the Richmond versus Croson case came down from the Supreme Court, I had the honor under Mayor Daley to be asked to put together one of the very first responses in the country to the new constitutional standards, which we'll get to in a minute. Also want to take this opportunity to thank the City of Charlotte. You've been a wonderful client. We really enjoyed working with you. And also to thank you for your support for the American Contract Compliance Association's National Training Institute, which will be held in Charlotte the third week in August. So we really appreciate everything that you've done with us, and we're all looking forward to spending time in your beautiful city. Also want to thank our local partners, Paradigm 360, Apex Business, and Viridian Marketing. They have been great to work with, and we appreciate all the support that they gave us on the ground and their outreach to the Charlotte community. And lastly, thanks much to Steve and Sean and Thomas. They have been my good partners, and I'm sure we bug them plenty, but they have done a fabulous job in supporting and managing this project. So someone there, I think, is going to advance the slides for me. So next slide, please. Okay. Wanted to start with a very brief, I promise, lawyers can be brief, discussion about what the legal standards are that govern race and gender conscious programs. As many of you have probably been following in the media, the federal courts are increasingly hostile to affirmative action and civil rights types of remedies. And so it's just absolutely critical that if you want to have a legally defensible race and gender conscious program, that you meet this very exacting standard called strict scrutiny. Strict scrutiny is the highest level of judicial review. The courts essentially start with the assumption that the agency must go forward with affirmative evidence of its own. So unlike many other types of litigation, the city would have the burden of going forward and producing evidence. So the courts will evaluate your program and your evidentiary basis for it under two tests, really. The first is whether or not you have a compelling interest in using the highly disfavored tool of race and gender in your contract decision making. Eradicating race discrimination is always a compelling interest. So effectively what this means is, does an agency have a strong basis in evidence that includes statistical and anecdotal data that there are current effects of discrimination and that race and gender are necessary to ensure a level playing field. If you get past this first prong or test, then the courts are going to evaluate whether the city's program and any remedies it adopts are quote unquote narrowly tailored to the evidence upon which you rely. Also note that the federal courts are very concerned that these programs not go on any longer than necessary, and so you do have the constitutional obligation to regularly review your evidence, which you have done. Next slide, please. So just a minute about some recent legal developments. I frankly want other people to be as concerned as I am. I think it's important to know kind of where the courts are going on these types of programs. Probably the most important one is that the federal government's COVID relief program through the United States Department of Agriculture to assist economically and socially disadvantaged farmers, this is sometimes called the Black Farmer Program, has been struck down by 3 trial courts, and a class action has been granted to a group of white farmers who are challenging the plan to provide some minor loan relief and technical assistance to Black and other minority farmers. The sad fact is that by the time this case winds its way up the courts, all the money will be gone. So in effect, the program to do something to assist Black farmers has been essentially struck down. A couple of other cases, there was also an attempt in the COVID relief packages to give priority to restaurant owners, small restaurant owners who were minority or socially disadvantaged or veterans. That too was struck down, and so that program is just in limbo altogether. And then some states tried to use some of their COVID relief funds to target them to specific groups who were negatively and disproportionately impacted by the coronavirus pandemic, and those have been struck down. So, not to be the voice of gloom and doom first thing in the day, but I do think people really need to have a good grip on how disfavored these programs are and how they are being attacked all across the country from all sides. Next slide, please. So turning now to your disparity study, we really had 4 objectives. The first one, and perhaps the most important, is to provide you a legal defense if any new program is challenged. As we've discussed, that is a critical component. The second thing was to be sure that we were meeting all of the constitutional requirements for programs. But we also think it's important that a disparity study provides you with some policy and program recommendations about how you can enhance your current activities and make sure that everyone has a full and fair opportunity to compete for your contracts. And then lastly, we try to use the study document as a tool to educate policymakers, business owners, community stakeholders about what these really quite complex legal and economic issues entail, so that you can build some consensus going forward about how the city is going to ensure equal opportunity for all firms. Next slide, please. So you see here our study data. We had several sources for your quantitative data records. You see there your vendor records, information from prime vendors, directories. We used Hoover's, which is what Dun & Bradstreet is now called, as our overall business universe. We looked at US Census data, and then there's quite a trove now of scholarly research about some of these issues. Turning to our qualitative or anecdotal data, we interviewed business owners and stakeholders, as well as city staff. Next slide, please. So what are the elements of the study? This just basically follows along with the table of contents, so I won't really spend any time on that because I'm going to go through all of these elements separately. Next slide, please. So let's turn to your program review first. Yes, the disparity study is designed to give you statistical evidence, but it's also an opportunity to take a deep dive into the operations of your current programs and get, in effect, feedback from your customers, namely your vendor community, both minority and women-owned and veteran-owned firms and small businesses, as well as overall business community. We interviewed 93 people, and we had a huge survey response of 490 completed responses, which is extraordinary, really. It might be the highest number we've ever seen. So there's a huge amount of interest in this program in your community. Generally, people told us the program works well and is necessary to create opportunities. Most of the MWBEs told us that they get little to no work outside of goals programs, that contractors who solicit them and use them on projects with goals, either for the city, perhaps the state, perhaps some of the transportation agencies, the airport, don't even solicit them in the absence of goals. And this has been very important in our successful defense of other agencies' programs, to be able to demonstrate to a court that the results of the program really reflect the city or the agency's efforts, not that discrimination has sort of magically disappeared. Prime vendors were usually able to meet their goals. Some scopes were definitely reported to be more difficult than others. Engineering firms said they face particular challenges that need to be probably addressed, and that only allowing firms located in the Charlotte statistical area severely restricted the pool of vendors that they could engage with. Next slide, please. Many firms asked that the city do its best to unbundle or disaggregate, different terms people use, contracts into either less complex scopes or smaller scopes or both. This will obviously permit smaller firms to bid and be successful as prime vendors, not just subcontractors. More technical support and assistance was requested by many firms, and that can range from the most basic business intro information, things like how to put a business plan together, all the way to much more sophisticated issues. So certainly more of that was something people would like. MWBEs want to be prime vendors. That came through loud and clear. Many of them, sort of depending on what industry they're in, really would like to have direct contracting relationships with the city and not be up under another firm. Excuse me. You do have the B2G electronic data collection and management system for your program, and people reported that that was effective, but that more actual monitoring was necessary. Many of the minority and women vendors wanted additional networking opportunities with city staff so they could introduce themselves to decision makers, as well as larger vendors with whom they might partner on future opportunities. There was a lot of support for a mentor-protege program, and we'll talk about that a little bit in the recommendations, and assistance with obtaining financing, surety bonding, and insurance was also a frequent ask. Next slide, please. So that's your program review. Turning now to your actual contract utilization information. We looked at 5 years worth of contracts from your fiscal year 2015 to 2020 for contracts that were $50,000 and greater. We limited it to contracts where there might be some opportunity for subcontracting. And also just as a practical matter, the city issues thousands of tiny POs every year. And you kind of have to limit the study in a way that's actually feasible to get it done. You see their final contract data file had about 750 prime contracts, totaling approximately $1.4 billion and the associated subcontracts. The federal courts require that a local agency determine its actual empirical geographic market. This is actually really a quantitative determination. You just have to go count and see where your firms are actually located. Again, the courts are very concerned that these programs not be infected by local politics. And so we really do take an empirical approach to this. It turned out that, in fact, almost 75% of your dollars were spent throughout the state of North Carolina, and it picked up one county in South Carolina. So following the judicial standards, that was the market area that we use for geography. Markets also have a product or industry dimension, not just a spatial dimension. And we found that there were 137 industry codes that were in the final contract data file. And NAICS stands for North American Industry Classification System. This is the taxonomy from the U.S. Census Bureau that is a standard approach to conducting economic research. Next slide, please. So in that final contract data file, you see there the city's utilization of minorities and women, and then broken out by the various racial groups. Do note that this includes both prime contracting dollars and subcontracting dollars. And in the study, there are many exhaustive charts that break this all down by 6-digit industry subcodes. Next slide, please. So you see there a pretty pie chart that says really the same thing. Next slide, please. And here, bar charts. So different ways to show the same information. Next slide, please. So that was the city's utilization of minority and women firms on its contracts during the study period that were over. There were $50,000 and over. So that's who actually got paid. The other important statistical piece that we had to determine was what firms were actually available in that market area in the 137 industry subcodes in which the city made purchases. And we had a rather extensive methodology for doing that. Unless people have questions, I mean, I can certainly answer them later, but I won't go into it right now. But in the end, the availability that we found, you see there on the slide. Let me explain quickly for a second what I mean by weighted availability. This availability really did take two steps. The first was to determine the unweighted availability of MWBEs as a percentage of all available firms. And that essentially is a straight head count. Who is out there? Just literally count them. But the courts and good economic analysis tell us that you need to take that head count and weight it by the city's actual spending patterns. If you don't, you can get some very odd results. So to just make up an example, it may be half of the restaurants in Charlotte's market area are minority owned. But the city spends very, very little money there. So if you count the restaurants at the same way that you're going to count, let's say, institutional building construction, you get some very skewed results. So the weighting is important. As I say, I'm happy to answer questions about it, and we go into it in rather exhaustive detail in the study. But you see there the actual results. So overall, minority and women's availability weighted came to a little bit over 13% in the city's marketplace. Next slide, please. So you see there another pie chart. And then next slide, please. I think, do we have a bar chart too? We do. There we go. So another way to see that availability. Next slide, please. So we have our two building blocks now for the disparity analysis that the federal courts require. And there are some equations that go with this, but it's basically a very simple idea. It is how tight is the fit between who was utilized and who was available. To the extent that there is a gap or a disparity there, and that disparity or gap is large enough, the federal courts have held that that can be prima facie evidence that the market failure of discrimination is operating in an agency's particular market area. And so you see there the results. The math is actually pretty simple, kind of once you see how the equations work, and it's just utilization divided by availability. So you see there that minority and women-owned firms overall had not fully reached parity, but the city's utilization was pretty close. And so you get a disparity ratio there of about 92%. So certainly what I take from this is that the city's program has been really quite successful in remediating discrimination and creating opportunities. You're not at 100% parity, but you're certainly over the 80% threshold for at least substantive significance. So this is definitely something for you all overall to be proud of, that you have done as good a job as you have of remediating discrimination in your market area. Next slide, please. So you can see there bar chart. Next slide, please. And another way to look at the data. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we do in our studies is when we see disparity ratios of over 100%, we want to take a deeper dive into that because one of the things that is apparent to me after all these decades is that the fact that overall minorities and women as a group or even as subgroups may be doing pretty well, that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is enjoying equal access to opportunities, let alone that discrimination has been fully ameliorated in your marketplace. This slide is an attempt to summarize some pretty complicated charts and analysis. But basically what we're asking ourselves is, are MWBEs more concentrated in a small subset of industries than non-MWBEs? So that we want to determine whether or not people are being utilized kind of across the board in proportion to their availabilities, or are they being kind of grouped together or sort of sub-concentrated? Because if there were true parity, you should get a ratio of 1-to-1. When you compare the share of contract dollars in any sub-industry that go to an MBE group it should be approximately the same as that share that goes to non-MWBEs. To the extent that you don't have ratios at least approximating a one-to-one, that suggests that there's a very heavy concentration of MWBEs in a few subsets of industries. And there you see what we actually found is that the ratio for Asians was about 0.5 to 1. So that's not close to parity there either, but that was heavy civil construction to 263 to 1 for Black firms in trucking. So what we take from that is that while overall MWBEs have done well, they are hyper-concentrated in a relatively small subset of industries. And that has implications, I think, for what you might want to focus on as a city going forward. Next slide, please. So that's the analysis of your own contract data. We also wanted to take a look at what was happening in the wider Charlotte area and North Carolina economies. This type of evidence has been particularly useful in our successful defense of programs that have been operating for some time. Because what we're interested in is how effective would a totally race neutral program be? While there is some business diversity activity or programs out there outside of government, overall it's really very little in the picture of the overall economy. So what we wanted to see was what was happening overall as a proxy for what might be the results if the city were to abandon its program and just engage in only race-neutral types of enhancements. So to do this, we looked at 2 Census Bureau databases. The first is the American Community Survey, which looks at individual entrepreneurs. And there we found that women and minority entrepreneurs formed fewer businesses than similar white males and earned less from the businesses that they did form. So there were still quite large disparities in overall business outcomes for minority and women business owners. The other one is the annual business survey, and this looks at firms as opposed to individuals. And again, we saw very large disparities in sales receipts between MWBE and non-MWBE comparable firms. So again, this is evidence that women and minority-owned firms, as a general matter in the economy, do not necessarily enjoy full opportunities. We also took a look at the extensive literature now on discrimination on the basis of race and gender to accessing commercial credit. Lots of studies coming out from the Federal Reserve, as well as academic studies and other not-for-profit think tanks. And it's really quite clear that minority-owned and women-owned firms, especially Black-owned firms, do not have equal access to business financing, which of course is critical to the success of any firm. And then finally, we took a look at some of the literature on human capital constraints. What do people need in order to go into business and be successful? And again, we saw disparities on the basis of race. Next slide, please. So that's our quantitative information. But we also wanted to gather anecdotal data, qualitative information. What are the experiences of actual individuals? People are the experts on their own lives and what works for them. So we did extensive interviews so that we could buttress the statistical information with what business owners told us about their experiences doing business with the city and in the Charlotte economy. Overall, minority and women firms told us that they still suffer from negative perceptions and stereotypes about their qualifications and capabilities. And you can read many of the comments are grouped in the anecdotal chapter. Some MWBEs said that they were unable to access industry or business networks that are necessary for success on an equal basis. Some minority owners reported that they had encountered truly blatantly hostile environments on the basis of race. Similarly, some women certainly continue to experience sexism and gender bias. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Oh, you skipped one. There we go. So those were the results of our actual interviews with business owners. But we also, as I mentioned before, did get 490 survey responses. They pretty much mirrored and in many cases expanded on the interviews. Certainly stereotyping, harassment, demeaning comments are still way too common that people are experiencing. Access to networks, again, was an issue. People reported that they often could not access information on a timely or equal basis, and obtaining working capital, surety bonding, and meeting insurance requirements was difficult on the basis of race and gender. Minorities and women were often not solicited for contracts without goals. Again, they were disproportionately reliant on government contracts. And many of them, and I think this is important because sometimes people will say, well, the minority and women firms don't have any capacity. Well, what people told me is they could certainly perform more work if they could get it. And that the way to grow their firms is to give them more opportunities, not just say, well, you haven't done it before, so you won't be able to do it in the future. Next slide, please. So those are all our findings. So now turning to our recommendations, we group them into two categories. The first are race and gender neutral approaches that will benefit all firms, and that would be open to everyone, regardless of whether they were certified as an MBE or a WBE. We think that a relatively simple but useful enhancement would be to develop long-term procurement forecasts. One of the things that's very challenging for small firms is being able to have enough time to put together teams, to be able to do that networking and outreach in advance of when solicitations come out. You know, by the time the thing hits the street, it may well be too late for people to be able to get themselves together and marshal their resources and their networks to be able to submit a proposal. The city has a really good quick pay program, and obviously keeping people paid is critical to their survival. And so we're suggesting extending that program to both firms that meet goals, as well as to all industries, so not just construction, and incentivize primes to participate in it by committing to them that you will pay them faster, because it's not going to work to tell them to pay the subs faster if they're not getting paid any faster. We recognize that this does require some resources on the part of the city, but getting paid quickly and regularly is just critical to these MWBE's ability to survive, let alone grow and thrive. Supportive service offerings could be expanded. The city actually has a pretty good menu of those already, but there are other types of assistance that people requested. For example, for construction firms in particular, how to properly estimate and how to deal with the paperwork that goes along with prevailing wages, safety compliance, all of those things. People wanted some more training on that. Several firms that have been in business for quite some time requested more support for the needs of mature MBEs, that there were good offerings for new firms, but people wanted assistance to try to take their businesses to the next level. Financing programs, of course, people need access to money, and there are many good models out there, and that was something that the city, we think, should consider. And then think about a technical assistance program for construction firms that is really holistic. It includes training. You get a surety and a lender to commit that firms that go through the program will, in fact, get bonded and get financed. And I have seen a couple of very successful models across the country. Don't want to pull the punch that these are not cheap to implement because they're very intensive, because they have a lot of one-on-one counseling But I have seen, but there's a Black woman-owned firm out of San Francisco that told me that the program took her from $500,000 in bonding to $5 million in bonding that permitted her to then work on the Central Subway project in San Francisco, which is over $1 billion project. So these programs can work, but they are resource intensive. Next slide, please. So turning now to race and gender conscious measures, we do believe in our judgment that the evidence in the study is sufficient for the city to continue to implement a race and gender conscious program. And that really is the first order question from a disparity study about setting MWBE contract goals. Do you have enough evidence that if you do not intervene, that you will be a passive participant in the marketplace failure of discrimination? And we do believe in our judgment that the quantitative and qualitative data support your ability to continue to move forward. We're suggesting using the study results to set your goals. Again, the court's required that you use the most current updated data that is highly detailed. And in order to have a defensible program, you really do have to stay tied to your data. So there are two types of goals. There's an overall annual aspirational goal, which is kind of everything all rolled up for your overall city spending for contracts covered by the program. And then there are contract goals, which could certainly be higher than the aspirational goal, could be lower, but that are designed to really reflect the specific scopes of work of a contract, the availability of firms to do that work, your progress towards meeting your goals, and then also taking into account any market factors. But setting narrowly tailored, defensible contract goals is really the key at this point, I think, to successful litigation defense. Because the courts require that your program be empirically based, we're suggesting that you expand your MWBE pool to your entire market area, which again is the state of North Carolina and York County, South Carolina. Next slide, please. We do think that there's some refreshes that could be done for your policies and procedures. One thing that seems to cause a lot of confusion and pain for staff as well as vendors trying to meet goals is using what are called NIGP goals. That's the National Institute of Government Purchasing, as opposed to using the Census Bureau industry codes that everybody uses for goal setting and certification. This will require some reconfiguring of the way the city does this, but we think it will really reduce the burden on everyone. And then your goals and your program will be aligned with your study data as well as the certification information that's out there in the certification directories. We're suggesting that you count the performance of MWBE prime firms towards meeting the goal on a contract. It's really pretty unusual not to do that. It turns your program into nothing but a subcontracting program. As we mentioned before, many of the MWBEs really want to be primes. In many ways, those are the biggest barriers, is to be able to lead the project, have the direct relationship. And there's really no reason not to allow this. The other thing, of course, is that it does circumscribe MWBE's ability to grow. So we're certainly suggesting that you move towards, I think, more the national best practice of counting self-performance. There was some confusion in program application about credit for MWBE participation in codes in which a firm might not be certified. Insisting that you only give credit for work that a firm performs in the codes in which it has been certified really is a program kind of integrity issue, and as well as making sure that your program is consistent. If a firm is not certified to do a particular code, then we suggest don't count it. Now, the certifying agencies are free to add codes, but this idea that maybe they are, maybe they won't, introduces a level of uncertainty that just seems not to be aiding much of anything. We're suggesting we're doing some tweaks to your good faith effort standards. We could go into the details of that, but we think that those could be tightened up a little bit. We're also suggesting that you be flexible about your remedies for any violations. Right now, there's kind of a rigid chart. This concerns me, that it may not meet the flexibility requirements of strict constitutional scrutiny, and that judgment be able to be used about the circumstances of particular failures to comply. We're suggesting a mentor-protege program. Everybody seems to really like these. If they're done correctly, they are not necessarily inexpensive to implement, because they do require staff time and someone to really oversee this so that it doesn't devolve into, people just going to lunch. Not that there's anything wrong with lunch, but really, how do we help these firms to grow and enter into new relationships? Next slide, please. And then our last 2 points really are to think about what success for your program means to the city of Charlotte. There are lots of ways to measure success. An obvious one is, are you meeting the goals? But I think there are other ways to think about it that may help to guide you as you go forward about where to focus what I know are scarce resources. So, for example, in addition to meeting the goals, are you getting new firms into the program? Are firms branching out into areas in which they themselves have not received work? Is the city getting MBE and WB participation in some of those codes where there hasn't been? Is MWBE participation less concentrated? There are lots of other ways to think about it, but we're suggesting that some focus and attention be given to how you want to measure success for yourselves going forward. And lastly, please do conduct regular program reviews. This is a judicial requirement, so you really can't skip it. But it's also an opportunity to see how you're doing, get feedback from your contracting community, and continue to move what really is a very successful and admirable program forward. So I think that is it for my slides. I think so. Yes, there we go. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Ms. Holt. In case anybody who's watching doesn't know all the background, I think it's worth saying that the CBI program, Charlotte Business Inclusion, is a program that we use in order to promote the inclusion of minority and women-owned and small businesses, as it currently stands, into the city's own contracting. So our purchase of services and the basic operation of this is that we ask contractors to demonstrate that they have included minority businesses in proportion to the representation of those minority businesses in that sector in our contracting. And there is a provision in there that allows them to demonstrate that they tried to do that and weren't able to. But that is a criterion that we use for deciding on contract awards. Just wanted to, I realize it's a simplification, but it occurred to me that there could be people watching who needed to know a little context. And I see that Mr. Phipps has his hand up.
Although actually, you know what, excuse me, Mr. Chair, I think that Mr. Coker and the CBI team have some slides that they wanted to do right after mine. Steve, was that the plan?
That's the plan, and I could be very quick and get through these.
So
Let's see, Mr. Phipps, is your question directed to Ms. Holt, and do you want to ask it now?
Well, I mean, I can certainly be flexible and wait, but my questions primarily deal with her presentation that she just wrapped up with. But I'm flexible. I can wait until after the other slides.
Yeah, again, I'll be really quick, and we've kind of designed this where those questions can follow, but of course, it's up to you, Mr. Phipps. So I can be quick, if you will.
All right, Ms. Dodson, I'll just point out, we've already gotten through the amount of time that was allocated to this subject. So I think we have a little slack in our schedule here, but we may need more time on this. Anyway, please talk to us.
Okay, next slide. Next slide, next slide. Okay, I'm going to start here. Again, for the record, Stephen Coker, Program Manager for the Charlotte Business Inclusion Program. And I want to start out by saying that by and large, this program works. Part of what we do is dependent on what Ms. Holt shared. And it's my vision that we'll do exactly what the manager has tasked us to do, and that is to become a nation's leading program. We see signs every day that we're moving positively in that direction. If you look at our last 3 years, our spend has increased. In 19, right before I just got here, we were at 133 million. And then last year, we came in at 163. That's a 19% increase. And then in our most recent annual report, you'll see that we've done $188 million in spend with our minority, women, and small businesses. That there is a 15% increase. And let me just say that all of the council members will receive the most recent annual report in your Thursday packets. In addition to that, I want you to know that the disparity study you receive, we're going to email you a full copy of the disparity study, those of you who are listening, in addition to the annual report. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay. What Ms. Holt presented can really be summed up if we looked at the major challenges. One, taking that aspirational goal and having it come in at 13.1%, expanding the 13 county CSA that we currently have to the entire 100 counties in the state of North Carolina, and then setting our goals on MWBEs only, as opposed to MWSBEs. We're not eliminating our SBE program, and we'll continue it, but we're looking to only set goals on MWBEs. Next slide. Okay, in the way of her recommendations, she talked about things that we should be doing, and I'll let you know that we're doing a lot of this already. A bonding program. You approved the funding for the administration of this program, $800,000. Thank you very much. Unbundling contracts, we're doing that. We'll look to do more. Providing technical support to our firms, helping our firms become prime contractors, taking them from subs to primes, and we're doing that as well, and providing more networking events, and using our B2G system to monitor contract compliance. All of these things we're currently doing, and we'll look to do more of. Next slide. And then these are things that we will ask you to get behind as we continue to do more. Again, they came in the way of recommendations from Colette. Next slide. Now, as far as the schedule, right at the top of the schedule, we're here today presenting this ED committee with the disparity study. On July 11th, we look to go to the full council to present the 2022 disparity study. Then in August, we're going to present or ask council to adopt the disparity study. And then in the summer, sometime in the summer, we'll present this to our CBI-AC, our advisory committee. And then in the fall, city staff, CBI-AC, ED Council Committee will review and recommend changes to the policy and procedures. And then in the fall, we'll ask our staff to work to craft policy changes in anticipation of the 2023 implementation. And then in the spring of 2023, staff will implement a communications and marketing plan for the 2022 disparity study. That's all I have to add at this point, so I want to open the floor up for questions.
Mr. Phipps.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. One of the things I wanted to get a feel for, and I think you might have touched on it a little bit even with these slides, was there any significant improvement on a comparative basis between the disparity study of 2017 and up to now? And I think you detailed our total MWSB spend grew pretty significantly during that time. But apart from that and the recommendations that you're making, did you discern any improvement in our work in comparative basis between the two studies?
I'll take that question, Steve Coker here. Between 2019 and 2020 annual report, we saw an increase of 40% in our spend. And 38% of that was with our MBEs, which was especially impressive considering that it was much less the year before. So we are seeing a increase in our spend, and when you get granular with all categories.
If I can add also, council member, we have 135 new certified minority businesses, and our actual African American spend, which is a subset of the MBE spend, increased in that time period by 40%. So we are really making great strides in unbundling for our small minority and women-owned businesses, and making sure that we're providing opportunities where there weren't opportunities before.
Thank you. Another thing that struck me in your presentation was, I guess, the prospects for weaning away from goals appears to not to be an option, in as much that that is limited access without the goal approach. So, I was kind of surprised that if you use a contractor with goals and they do a good job, I mean, that really doesn't transform into soliciting their services at a subsequent time or not.
Well, let me try and answer that. You can't really necessarily say uniformly that that's the case, but what people report and what we certainly see when we look at the economy-wide data is that minority and women firms really don't get much work outside of these government programs. I can certainly say that when I started working on this stuff in 1989, that I was perhaps thinking that, well, all that has to happen is people have to see how great our minority-owned firms are and what a good job they do, and then they'll keep using them. But unfortunately, I think the barriers are much deeper than that. Now, it certainly is the case that some people have been able to use the programs as a springboard to private sector work. But by and large, minority and women firms tell us that they just don't get much work outside these programs, and that firms that use them to meet goals don't use them on contracts that don't meet goals, and sometimes they're very explicit about it, as in, well, there's no goal on this project, so we don't have to use you.
Okay, I got two questions I'll wrap up. So you said that 74% of our work is within the state of North Carolina and York County. Where's the other 26% dispersed?
Well, I can certainly look at the study to tell you. I honestly can't remember all the counties and whatnot. But it's North Carolina. It's across the country. I mean, so many markets now really are more national. That was where the majority of your spend was concentrated. But we do actually have the county spend in the study itself. So we can certainly look at that for you.
Okay, I can get that offline. Now, you mentioned that you didn't specifically say that credit barriers remain high, but you really said that credit discrimination barriers remain high. Mm-hmm. So, given that we know that, I don't know what, as a city or what can we do to try to help remedy that? Because that seems to be a pretty, I mean, you really associated discrimination as being the major reason where there's a credit barrier. So if that's the case, I'm wondering then, would that require us to be more proactive in trying to see what we can do to help remedy that or not?
Well, certainly, of course, as a city, you don't control the banking system. And so what we've seen that is at least partially effective. I don't want to suggest to you, sir, that the city of Charlotte's going to be able to remedy race discrimination throughout the financial system. I think that's just not real, as you know. However, there are some good financing programs out there where lenders agree that they will, in fact, loan to certified firms who've gone through some of the training programs. There's some other things out there that we've seen, like linked deposit programs, where a city government will say to its depository institutions that we want you to make loans and be willing to use our city contracts as collateral for financing. Sometimes that does require some changes in other parts of city government or codes. Many agencies will not let a vendor use its contract as collateral. So there are some things to look at. So I do think that you can help. I don't think you can fix it all, but I do think that you can help. And then the other thing is make sure you're paying promptly and your contractors are paying promptly, because you won't have as much need for lines of credit if your cash flow is consistent and on time.
My final question is, you said that we should continue to implement narrowly tailored race and gender approaches, but then I thought one of your recommendations was that we need to move towards a race and gender neutral approach. So I'm trying to figure out how those two reconcile each other.
Well, the courts require that you use race-neutral measures to the maximum feasible extent. So to the, if there are in fact additional areas where you can enhance race-neutral measures, you need to do that. It's both constitutionally required, as well as the types of tools that generally will help MWBEs to be primes. So you need to do both. It's not an either or. Certainly the courts want us all to march towards race-neutral measures, but at least in our view, those enhance an MWB program, but we don't see any evidence out there that they're going to fully replace goals. And especially because what we see is when there are not goals, we do not see minorities and women enjoying full and fair opportunities.
Mr. Phipps?
Thank you. Okay, go ahead.
Let me just piggyback on this from a legal standpoint. A good example of what Colette is indicating would be the MWBE goal setting, which is a race-conscious, gender-conscious component. But as Steve alluded to, the bonding program would be a race-neutral component that will support everyone as they're moving forth. So those two components, one being race-conscious, being paired with a race-neutral, would be actually moving the program in a manner that is constitutionally sound in that regard. So that's an example of what Colette is articulating as to how this program could be structured.
I appreciate your responses. Thank you.
So we have only 3 of our members here. Thomas, in a committee meeting, is it a majority of the quorum, or is it 3 votes that are needed to take an action?
As I understand, it's always been majority of the entire committee. Now, you have moved forward without taking a vote, depending on those other members. Being that you have 3 at this time, you could actually take action to recommend that this go before the council for the full actual briefing. And you could also then recommend, again, as staff at this time would like a recommendation to adopt the actual disparity study.
Right. My concern is I have a lot of questions. We don't have time to discuss them all, so I'm not prepared to support a referral to the full council. I think there's more work that needs to be done in this committee. And frankly, I would like to have the conversation with the chairman present, so as not to occupy the acting chair and express opinions that may not be consistent with the majority. So if we don't vote today, then I guess, Ms. Dodson, what are our options?
We could bring it back at the next committee meeting. Now, that would potentially delay when we take it to council and the process with council, which I'm looking to the team in terms of the timeline and things like that.
Yeah, from a timing perspective, Mr. Driggs, we certainly could. The consequence would likely be that the new council would vote on the adoption of the study, which is not untenable by any means. It's just the way the calendar would lay out.
And let me just also, just to make sure for your question, Mr. Driggs, again, the adoption of the report and the actual ending of any race-conscious or gender-conscious measures would be two of the primary action items that we would ask this committee to look at, as well as the full council. But if this committee is not comfortable at this time making that recommendation, by all means, to what Phil is indicating, we could look at revising our schedule to meet your expectations.
Well, I'm just telling you that the situation I see right now with two of our members not present and with me not ready to vote in favor of a referral or to vote this out of this committee yet, I don't see how we can do anything today. So I think we need to think in terms of another schedule.
Can I ask a question, Mr. Driggs? Can you just talk about, and if we've got to move in order to have discussion, I'm fine with moving to do so, but what are your concerns that will prevent us from moving forward to full council for further discussion?
As I say, we just absolutely do not have time. I'm not going to try and have this conversation in 5 minutes. We have two more agenda items. I think issues like going statewide versus local, not including small business, there are some topics that council and this committee need to be thoughtful about, and we've been put in a position where there is really no time for an in-depth conversation. So all I can say is I'm not prepared to vote for it.
Are those two items then, if we were to move this forward to full committee, is it in any way, Thomas, an endorsement of a position of whether we actually end up removing small business or moving to state?
So from a legal...
My feeling about the responsibility of this committee is that we conduct a review, that we explore the topics, and that we report to full council what our finding was on some of these issues. Otherwise, we didn't need to have this meeting. We could have just kicked it to the full council right away.
Thomas?
We have not had a chance to delve in any detail into some of the issues related to this. I mean, I have questions, for example.
But can Thomas answer my question, though?
What is your question?
Mr. Driggs,
I'm not going to go for it, Victoria. I'm just not going to do it.
I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm asking Thomas for clarity.
I gave you an example. I think there's a lot that we need to talk about that we don't have time to talk about, and
I'm not asking about any of that. I appreciate that. I asked a question to the attorney. I am waiting for an answer from the attorney. I'm not asking anything about your position.
What's the attorney's question?
Mr. Driggs, the question that was posed to me would be related to the SBE issue as well as the statewide issue. Is it possible to remove those items at this time for consideration or as part of the CBI recommendation for the report to move forward to council? That's what I understand as being the direct question from Councilmember Watlington. From a legal perspective, the aspect of the statewide market is an integral part of the disparity study. If you were to be challenged from a legal perspective, and I would have to go to court to defend this actual program, the statewide market of North Carolina as well as York County is integral to that determination. If that were to be modified in any way, shape, or form, that would undermine the legal basis for your program and the legal justification for race-conscious and gender-conscious actual measures. The SBE program, again, as I understand it, and I'm looking to Steve on this one as well as to Colette, the recommendation for the SBE component is to eliminate that on a procurement perspective if there is MWBE goals only. meaning we have a contract for M and W goals. Those are the only goals that would be actually levied for that contract for procurement purposes. If there is no M's and no W's, you then may be able to use an S goal in those instances where there are no M's or W's available for that particular contract. But generally speaking, from a construction standpoint, we're going to have M's in those contracts, so it's not likely to be an S goal in any construction contracts. But any of our other service contracts, you may not have M's registered in our program, so therefore that's S's could be available on those other types of contracts. So I'm looking to Steve just to, if he can say yes or no on that. Is that your understanding?
Yes.
And Colette, I'm looking to you as well as the consultant. Is that your understanding as well?
Yes, Thomas, you put it very well, and that really is the recommendation, not to get rid of the SBE program, but to not set a third goal on your contracts where there is adequate availability of women and minority-owned firms to perform. As Thomas said, if there's a procurement that for whatever reason you're not going to set any MBE or WBE goals, then you could certainly put an SBE goal on it. The other race-neutral components of your program would be open to SBEs. So that is the change that we're recommending.
Thank you.
So with that being said, to Councilmember Watlington's question, as part of the committee's discussion and approach, again, if there's additional questions, I think the entire CBI staff, and myself included, can answer those questions depending on how you wish to proceed. Mr. Vice Chair, again, we can defer to your guidance and other members of the committee. Depending on the situation, I will say, at least for this committee, those questions may be handled directly by your city staff, and we will consult with Colette Holt if there's any need to answer any questions. But in regards to Colette, she probably will not be in those meetings unless we need to bring her back for another economic development meeting or for the full council.
I'm just sort of at a loss. I mean, this is supposed to be a 5-member committee. I would have assumed in the normal course of events that if I had any issues, I could just say no, and that wouldn't obstruct the progress of it. But I do unfortunately have issues. I have a lot of questions. I think Ms. Holt did a great job, and I appreciate her candor describing the tougher legal environment we're in and some of the standards that are applicable. I haven't reached a level of comfort yet that we are completely safe, and I would really appreciate a memorandum from the city attorney's office laying out the position of the city's attorney's office on why the risks associated in the current legal environment are ones that we can responsibly take. And also, I think the report that we've just seen kind of commingles two things. One of them is a narrower document that demonstrates our compliance with federal laws and is sort of quantitative. It addresses the specific issues. And the other one is sort of general recommendations that we can pursue separately about how we can work with the minority business community. I don't think that we should, personally, I'm not a lawyer, but I don't think that we should incorporate any kind of special attention to the minority business community, the MBE community, as a part of this study, but rather we should be very focused narrowly on explaining why it is that the requirements of the law are met by where we are and what we're doing. If we're at 92% right now, for example, and 80% is the standard, then that suggests to me that we're open to a challenge. I don't know, for example, whether if we were challenged and if the challenge were upheld, there could be penalties associated with that, or all it would mean is that we have to terminate the program. But these are, as I say, I just feel a little overwhelmed. I don't see how we can address these topics with two more topics to go in this meeting and only 3 members present.
Mr. Driggs, this is Phil Rieger. Totally comfortable with extending the schedule a little bit to give some more time to answer some more questions. And so if that's the pleasure of the rest of the committee, we can do that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Mr. Driggs. I just want to make sure, as per your request to the attorney's office, You asked for a memo to be provided to this committee, and just want to make sure I have my language correct, about the associated risks of adopting the study, and outlined that to this committee. Is that correct?
Yes, I want to have an opinion for our lawyers, the people to whom we turn for guidance, that the plan as proposed does not present any unacceptable legal risks. I mean, I respect Ms. Holt and her experience in this space, but we have, she's not accountable to us. Our city attorneys are. So I think the explanation we just got it needs to be delivered to us by our own in-house counsel as a basis for our action on this, for our discussion of this.
Point of order. I apologize. Go ahead, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, I was just going to say, that's not a problem, Mr. Driggs. I will work with Patrick Baker to address this question and its subparts and address it with the committee as well. I would definitely say to Councilmember Phipps as well as Councilmember Wallington, if there's any other legal concerns that you're having, definitely please let me know at your convenience, and we can actually discuss that in person or over the phone, Patrick Baker and I, related to this, just to make sure you're fully aware of not only the legal implications or any other legal questions that you may have, but that you're fully informed of what could be next steps or implications thereof. So I'll at least get this memo started, but in the interim, like I said, any additional questions, please let me know, and I will definitely work with Phil, Steve, and Sean on any other operational aspects.
A point of order, I've got a question. Given that Councilmember Ajmira was here and has left, does it follow the general rule that her vote would be in the affirmative for any additional votes?
It is checked out of the meeting. That rule applies if you're in the meeting.
No. Well, that's my question. If in this virtual environment, if somebody was in attendance and left, how is their vote recorded for the additional votes?
Mr. Chair, that appears to be a legal question that's being asked.
Yeah, for
Okay.
Thomas, I apologize.
All right,
Yeah.
not a problem. So let me just verify one particular matter first before I give a legal opinion. I'm looking at the NADA just to verify. Councilmember Ajmira did attend the meeting?
Yes, Ms. Ajmira was on the meeting, and she was on video, and then she dropped off.
We don't have to hold up the discussion for right now, but if we could circle back to it, I just would like an answer. We could proceed with the agenda for now.
Let me just say, from a legal standpoint, if this had been an in-person meeting and then
Right.
Councilmember Ajmira had left the meeting, then to your question, the answer would be yes, her vote would actually count. But because it's a remote meeting and she actually came onto the remote meeting and now has departed, we cannot actually count her vote because in order to have the actual vote, Councilmember Driggs will have to do a roll call vote, and her lack of actually being on the meeting at this time prevents her vote from being recorded at all.
Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Also, we don't know how she'd vote. I mean, there's no presumption. We could get her in a presumption of a yes vote. I wouldn't want to do that to her. I think we need to hear from her.
And that's all well and good. My question is a procedural question, because if this was an in-person meeting, we would have no problem having a presumption. But either way, the question was asked and answered. Thank you.
Okay. So staff, all I can recommend is you work out whether we need another meeting of this committee or talk to the chair and find out how he wants to proceed. Given my own situation right now, I mean, I recognize that this is a popular program that CBI is. The large majority of council is going to be very supportive, but we find ourselves in this strange situation where the fact that I have misgivings means that the committee can't take action. And I would just suggest that maybe a couple of us talk to the chair and find out how he wants to proceed.
Thank you, Councilmember Driggs. We will work with the chair and staff and work on the best next steps, understanding like so many topics that we're trying to get through with this council, and see what we can come up with.
In that case, I reckon we have time for one of the two remaining topics on the agenda. So Ms. Dodson, do you have a preference?
Yes, I would like to do the quarters of opportunity update. I think we can accomplish that in the time that we have left. We can come back to the higher Charlotte update and at another meeting. The importance of the corridors of opportunity is, we have a lot going on with corridors of opportunity, and we recognize that sometimes you all don't see all of the pieces that are happening. And I think last time we talked to you about how we wanted to restructure internally, but also highlight some of the other work we're doing. Just as a side note, I think it was last Monday or this Monday before last, there was a council action item for a housing project that was at Beatties Ford and LaSalle. And it was a part of our original vision for that intersection, the work that we were doing at that intersection, but it wasn't connected as a council action to something of corridors of opportunity. And that's something that, as recent as this week, Donata and I have been talking about. How do we make sure that you all have that visibility on what's going on with corridors of opportunity? And so, we'll go through this really quickly. Next slide. You all know what the corridors are. And one of the things that we've done before, I'm going to let Monica jump in. Internally, we've restructured a little bit to try to create more capacity for staff, to create more opportunity to get more work done. And working in 6 corridors is kind of difficult. We were working in 2 pretty well, but we can't keep working in 2 and add on the others without some kind of restructure and growing the pie of the team. And so we have brought Monica Holmes in as our Corridors of Opportunity Director, or czar, or whatever we want to call her. And we are also looking at hiring 2 other positions. So Monica, I'm going to let you kind of take it from here, talk a little bit about what's happening in the city, and then I'll come back at the end.
Sure. I'm very glad to be here. You can go to the next slide, Donata. So corridors of opportunity.
Monica, tell us a little about yourself.
Oh, sure. Sure, I can do that. My name is Monica Carney Holmes. I've been in the planning department for 7 years, and I run the design and preservation division. So that includes the Urban Design Center and all of our historic districts. I am doing this as kind of wearing 2 hats. So this hat with the Corridors of Opportunity, and you'll see in a second, is really a citywide role. So it will bring together all of those. So before I was at the city, or I've been at the city, I was in the private sector for about 12 years, doing mainly large planning efforts for multiple clients kind of across the country and even a few internationally. You might remember me. I did the Trans-Northern Development Ordinance that passed, I believe now 2.5, 3 years ago. 3 years ago, time flies. So if I'm a familiar face, then you might remember me from there. And since that time, I've been working on other larger initiatives with CATS and the Silver Line, working behind the scenes some in South Park, and I'm excited about this new role. I think it's a great opportunity. My staff and I have been involved in corridors since the beginning and kind of serving as a resource for that and leading some of the playbook efforts, doing some of the implementation work. But again, this is different and really kind of bringing it all together and all the moving pieces amongst the departments.
So it's not such a huge leap. Okay, so now fast forward through the slides.
Sure. Okay, so what you are seeing right now is where we are headed with corridors. So we are really amping up the volume and prioritizing this as we move from really 2 corridors into implementation to 4 and then 6. So that requires us to think horizontally how, again, we all work together in transportation and planning and economic development, CMPD, and really all the departments working together. We have, again, my position that was just appointed, and you'll see in a second kind of how we're building out that team. And then we'll talk through what are the things we're doing in the next 3 months. What does that roadmap look like? And then Tracy will hit on the structure, both internally and externally with our partners. So we can go to the next slide. So again, just to visualize what we just talked through, there is a team of 6, now 7 directors and key senior leadership staff that I report to, work with, that bring together all of the different facets of corridors. So that's transportation, transit, CMPD, housing and neighborhood services, economic development, and our communications team, and general services. So I work up to them, and thankfully, we've realized that we need to flesh that out even more because I am one person, and there are a lot of things going on in corridors, both internally and externally. So we actually are hiring right now 2 positions, one that will be the point person on all the community engagement related to corridors. They will actually still sit in our community engagement team that many of you are probably familiar with and work very closely with those, the leads in the different corridors to really formulate a strategy that addresses how we're working with the community and how we're providing the updates that everybody would like to hear and how we're kind of messaging that. Then the operations lead will be my right hand, really the deputy program manager for corridors, thinking both strategically and tactically as to how we get the work done and keeping all of our departments kind of moving in lockstep for me. So it's very exciting. And we've had, just as I'm very proud of this, we had 50 people apply for the community engagement job and 70 apply for the program manager. So I think that shows that people are excited.
It does definitely, I think, demonstrate what has been started with the energy around corridors of opportunity. And I think this, with the manager, we've had a lot of conversations about this is a new way of really, I think, internally us working in a cross-collaborative manner. You have the director's team, but then, Monica really comes from a foot in planning, the community engagement person, housing and neighborhood services, the operations person will sit in economic development, and how you have this kind of, again, cross-departmental team that is really leaning in to think strategically about how all the work in the corridors is getting done.
Yeah, you can go to the next slide, Donata. So this is just walking you through what June, July, August, September look like. So we have relaunched that implementation team to reflect that cross-collaborative structure. We're working on hiring, as I just mentioned. We are getting ready to put together a roadmap for Albemarle and how we will take the playbook and make it happen. That will happen in July. We'll do the same thing with Sugar Creek. There's so much great work there over the past 2 to 3 years, but we need to go into action. So July, August, we'll do those for both Sugar Creek and Albemarle. September, we will launch North Tryon, North Graham in a public way and really get going quickly in that corridor. And as that is happening, Sugar Creek and Albemarle will move into implementation. So obviously, we have ongoing efforts in Beatties Ford and West Boulevard, and we don't want to forget about those. As Tracy mentioned, things are going to council fairly frequently on those projects. But we want you to be well aware that we will be very busy this summer putting those 3 and 4 and then 5 and 6 corridors forward and into action.
Next slide. So Monica laid out a lot of kind of what we're doing as a city and the organization, but one of the things that we're also doing, and you've heard us talk about this before, is there's a lot of external partners that are working in our corridors, and how do we collaborate with them to leverage everybody's investments? A lot of times, because communities and nonprofits and private sector know that we have the playbooks, they come to us and they say, where do we need to invest? How do we need to invest? And so we're really trying to establish this collaborative partnership where we don't do playbooks in a silo, right? We bring some of the nonprofits and the private sector partners along with us and develop that. But really, we need to create this kind of advisory council, if you will, that understands all the pieces of what's happening in the corridors. We still have our own governance. We would all still have our own individual governance boards, i.e., I would never bring a project to the advisory council that wouldn't be approved by council, things like that. But it is an opportunity to bring a collaborative partnership together that everybody looks at how investments are being made. And so it's collaboration with examples of United Way or the Knight Foundation or other organizations that are making investments or doing work in the corridors to make sure that, again, we're leading to the impact that the community really wants to see, and that everybody knows we can share what we've learned from our playbooks and help guide investments that others are potentially making as well. And so more to come on that. That's kind of one of our next steps that we're trying to formalize and bring together. With that, we had got through it all pretty quickly. I know we are right at time. I thought it was just important to make sure everybody knew some of the internal changes that we'd made as you're talking to people in your communities and corridors. Monica's a great point person. The team is much bigger behind her now to be able to continue to get a lot of work done in the corridors.
I appreciate that we're putting more structure around this. We've talked about corridor investments and it wasn't really quite clear where the money was going. So Monica, welcome to that function. And I don't see hands up. Are there any questions from committee members? Do we need to talk about a date for the next meeting, Ms. Dodson, or can we schedule that later?
I think right now there's one scheduled for the beginning of August. I'm looking at Donata. August 1st. Is the next scheduled one. As I mentioned earlier, I will talk to the chair about potentially one in July if it works for the committee, if we need to do that to discuss further the disparity study.
Yeah, we'll want to keep it moving, so it may be necessary to have a meeting when everybody's able to be present. And I can also get answers to some of my questions offline in the meantime. Otherwise, do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
All right. Thank you, everybody.